Summer 1940. The world was on fire. The German Wehrmacht had just crushed France in 6 weeks using a revolutionary combination of tanks and mechanized infantry. In Washington, D.C., the United States Army watched the newsreels with growing panic. They realized they were woefully unprepared for modern warfare. While the Germans had Kubelwagens and specialized military vehicles, the U.S. Army was still relying on technology from the First World War. Their reconnaissance units rode motorcycles with sidecars, which tipped over in rough terrain, or they used converted civilian sedans that bogged down in the mud. Worst of all, a huge percentage of the Army's logistics still relied on the mule and the horse. The Quartermaster Corps knew they needed a replacement for the horse, something mechanical, tough, and capable of going anywhere. On July 11, 1940, the Army issued a challenge to 135 American car manufacturers. It was a request for a light reconnaissance vehicle. The specifications were absurdly demanding. The vehicle had to have four-wheel drive. It had to carry a crew of 3 and a machine gun. It had to be low to the ground, stable, and powerful. But the kicker was the weight limit. It had to weigh less than 2,300 pounds, 590 kilos, and the deadline was insane. The Army demanded a working prototype in 49 days and 70 test vehicles in 75 days. The giants of Detroit, Ford and Chrysler, looked at the proposal and laughed. Their engineers said it was physically impossible to build a four-wheel drive vehicle that light in that amount of time. They refused to bid. Only 2 companies responded. One was Willys Overland, a struggling mid-size manufacturer. The other was the American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. Bantam was not a giant. It was a corpse. The company was bankrupt. It had no engineering staff left. It had ceased production. Its factory was silent. But it had a desperate salesman named Frank Fenn, who saw this contract as the only way to save the company from liquidation. He lied to the Army, claiming they had the capacity. He accepted the challenge. But Bantam had no engineer to design the car. In a panic, Fenn called Karl Probst, a brilliant but eccentric freelance engineer in Detroit. Probst initially refused. He didn't want to work for a bankrupt company on a suicide mission. But the Army pressured him, appealing to his patriotism. On July 17th, Probst arrived at the Bantam factory. He found a ghost town. He cleared off a drafting table and went to work. What followed was one of the greatest feats of industrial design in history. Probst worked for 18 hours straight, chain-smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. He didn't just sketch a concept, he drew the blueprints for the entire vehicle, the suspension, the chassis, the transmission linkages, the body panels. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the Jeep existed on paper. Probst had made crucial decisions that would define the vehicle. He realized the Army's weight limit was impossible, but he decided to ignore it, betting that if the car performed well enough, the Army would raise the limit. He chose off-the-shelf parts from other suppliers to speed up production, axles from Spicer, a transmission from Warner, and a Continental engine. It was a Frankenstein vehicle, stitched together from the spare parts bin of the American auto industry. The Bantam team, a handful of mechanics working in a corner of the empty factory, had 48 days to turn the drawings into metal. They worked around the clock. They hand-hammered the body panels. They welded the frame from scrap steel. On September 23, 1940, day 49th, the prototype known as Old No. 1 was finished. Karl Probst got behind the wheel. He had no time for testing. He drove it out of the factory and straight toward Camp Holabird in Maryland, 250 miles away. He was braking in the engine on the way to the delivery. When Old No. 1 arrived at the Army proving grounds, the officers were skeptical. It looked tiny. It looked like a toy. It had no doors, no roof, and a flat, ugly hood. It looked nothing like a military machine. But then the tests began. The test driver took the Bantam vehicle into the mud. He drove it through sandpits that had swallowed the Army's heavy trucks. He drove it up a 60-degree dirt slope. The little car, with its torquey engine and light weight, scrambled up the hill like a goat. It didn't get stuck. It didn't tip over. The generals watching from the observation stand were stunned. They realized they were looking at the future of mobility. However, the Warforge is a cruel place for the little guy. The Army loved the Bantam design, but they looked at the Bantam factory, small, bankrupt, and chaotic, and realized the company could never produce the hundreds of thousands of vehicles they needed. The Quartermaster Corps made a controversial decision. They argued that the design now belonged to the government. They took Karl Probst's blueprints, the drawings he had made in 18 hours, and handed them over to Willys and Ford. They told the giants, "Copy this, improve it, and build us a prototype." It was industrial theft on a massive scale, justified by the emergency of war. Bantam had done the impossible work of invention, but they were about to be pushed aside by the power of mass production. Willys took the Bantam design and added their powerful Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower beast that gave the Jeep its legendary grunt. Ford took the design and applied their genius for stamping metal. Ford simplified the front grille from a heavy welded grate to a single piece of stamped steel with 9 vertical slots, creating the iconic Jeep face that we know today. By 1941, the three companies were competing in a runoff. The Army took the Bantam, the Willys, and the Ford prototypes and tortured them. They drove them until the axles broke. They drove them until the engines boiled. In the end, the Army decided to standardize. They chose the Willys design because of its superior engine, but they incorporated the Ford flat hood and stamped grille. And in a final twist of irony, they gave the main production contracts to Willys and Ford. Bantam, the creator, was given a consolation prize, a contract to build trailers to be pulled by the cars they had invented. The vehicle was officially designated the Truck 14-Ton 44. But the soldiers didn't call it that. Some say the name came from the designation GP, General Purpose. Others say it came from the character Eugene the Jeep in the Popeye cartoons, a magical creature that could go anywhere and solve any problem. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. The Jeep was born. And as the first assembly lines began to roll in Toledo, Ohio and Detroit, Michigan, nobody realized that this ugly little box on wheels was about to change the geography of the war. It was about to render the German concept of the Blitzkrieg obsolete, because while the Germans relied on roads, the Jeep brought its own road with it. By 1942, the factories in Toledo and Detroit were humming with a rhythm that would define the American war effort. Every 2 minutes, a finished Willys MB or Ford GPW rolled off the assembly line. But building them was only half the battle. The real challenge was getting them to the front lines. The Atlantic Ocean was a barrier of 3,000 miles, infested with German U-boats. Shipping space was the most precious resource in the world. A fully assembled Jeep took up a lot of volume, airspace that could be used for ammunition or food. So the engineers at Ford applied their logic of mass production to logistics. They invented the knocked down or KD Jeep. They didn't ship the car. They shipped the ingredients. They disassembled the Jeep into its primary components, chassis, body, wheels, engine, and packed them into a single wooden crate. The crate measured exactly 3 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 7 feet long. It was a miracle of packaging Tetris. The wheels were tucked under the fenders. The windshield was folded flat. The radiator was drained. These crates could be stacked 5 high in the hold of a Liberty ship. When the ship arrived in Liverpool, Murmansk, or Cairo, a crew of 4 mechanics could pry open the crate with crowbars and assemble a fully functioning vehicle in under 20 minutes. It was the IKEA concept applied to warfare, but with steel and horsepower. This logistical fluidity meant that the Jeep appeared everywhere, seemingly overnight. When the first American troops landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, they didn't have to wait for heavy cranes to unload tanks. They manhandled the Jeep crates onto the sand, bolted the wheels on, filled the gas tank and drove off to fight Rommel. The Germans were baffled. Their own logistical tale was heavy and slow. They relied on trains to move vehicles. The Americans brought their transportation with them in boxes. One of the most critical destinations for these crates was the Soviet Union. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States sent thousands of Jeeps to the Red Army. The Russian soldiers, accustomed to the primitive roads of the East, which turned into rivers of mud during the spring thaw, fell in love with the American machine. They called it the Willys. It had a heater, the engine heat leaking through the firewall. It had 4-wheel drive, and it was light enough that if it got stuck, 4 men could physically lift it out of the mud. The German equivalent, The Volkswagen Kübelwagen was a brilliant design by Ferdinand Porsche, but it had a fatal flaw. It was only two-wheel drive. In the deep Russian snow, or the glue-like mud of the Rasputitsa, the Kübelwagen spun its wheels and died. The Jeep kept moving. Soviet commanders often abandoned their own staff cars to ride in Jeeps. There is a famous anecdote that Joseph Stalin, usually critical of Western aid, specifically asked for more Bantams, using the old name, because they were the only things that could keep pace with his T-34 tanks during an offensive. The Warforge of Detroit was unwittingly powering the spearhead of the communist advance, but the most romantic and violent adaptation of the Jeep happened in the scorching sands of North Africa at the hands of the British Special Air Service, SAS. The SAS, led by the eccentric David Stirling, needed a vehicle to raid German airfields deep behind enemy lines. They looked at the standard Jeep and saw a blank canvas. They stripped it down. They removed the windshields. Glass reflects sun and gives away position. They cut off the radiator grill bars to increase airflow in the desert heat. They welded racks for dozens of jerry cans of fuel and water on the hood and sides. Most importantly, they upgunned it. They mounted twin Vickers K machine guns, rapid-fire guns taken from aircraft, on the passenger side and the driver's side. Some Jeeps carried heavy .50 caliber Brownings. These modified vehicles, often painted pink to blend in with the desert haze at dawn, looked like porcupines of weaponry. They were pirate ships of the dunes. The SAS tactics were suicidal and brilliant. They would drive hundreds of miles through the impassable Great Sand Sea, navigating by the stars like sailors. They would approach a German airfield at night, shut off their engines and coast in. Then on a signal they would light up the parked Ju-87 Stukas and Mi-109s with thousands of rounds of incendiary ammunition. In one raid on the airfield at Sidi Hanaish, a column of 18 SAS Jeeps drove onto the runway in formation, firing outwards like an 18th-century naval broadside. They destroyed 37 German aircraft in 15 minutes. The German guards were helpless. They couldn't track the fast-moving, low-profile Jeeps in the dark. The Pink Panthers would then speed away into the desert, leaving burning wreckage behind. The Jeep had transformed from a delivery truck into a strike fighter. It proved that in the hands of creative soldiers, the simple American box could be adapted to any form of warfare. The versatility of the machine became a legend among the GIs. The flat, wide hood wasn't just a cover for the engine, it was a map table for generals, an operating table for field medics, an altar for chaplains saying Mass, and a poker table for privates. The radiator water was used for shaving. The engine heat cooked rations. A Jeep could pull a plow, power a saw with a belt attached to the wheel, or act as a generator. It was the Swiss Army knife of the 20th century. However, the Jeep was not without its dangers. It had no armor. A single bullet could pierce the thin sheet metal skin and kill the occupants. It had a high center of gravity and a narrow wheelbase, making it prone to rolling over if a driver took a corner too fast, a flaw that killed thousands of soldiers in non-combat accidents. The Jeep lean became a familiar sight in ditches across Europe, and there were no safety belts. If you hit a mine, you were thrown clear, which, grimly, was often better than being trapped inside. Despite these flaws, the emotional bond between the soldier and the Jeep was profound. It was the only mechanical constant in their lives. Tanks broke down. Trucks got stuck. The Jeep kept going. As the war moved to Italy and then France, the Jeep became the symbol of liberation. When American troops entered a village, the first thing the civilians saw wasn't a tank. It was a Jeep with a wire cutter welded to the front bumper, carrying dusty men handing out chocolate. It was the ambassador of the Warforge, a machine that didn't scream dominance like a Tiger tank, but whispered capability. By 1943, the Jeep had conquered the desert and the steppe. But its biggest test was yet to come. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Fortress Europe. They needed to get thousands of vehicles across the English Channel and onto the beaches of Normandy. And the Jeep, with its lightweight and compact size, would be the first vehicle to touch French soil, carried in gliders made of wood and canvas that would crash land behind enemy lines in the dark. The unstoppable box was about to learn how to fly. By the spring of 1944, The Allies were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord. The plan required dropping thousands of paratroopers behind the German lines in Normandy to seize bridges and crossroads. But paratroopers are light infantry. They have no heavy weapons, no transport, and limited ammunition. Once they hit the ground, they are foot soldiers, vulnerable to German panzers. The planners knew that for the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to survive, they needed mobility. They needed jeeps. But you cannot drop a jeep by parachute, at least not with the technology of 1944. The solution was a desperate marriage of wood and steel, the Waco CG-4A glider. The Waco was essentially a large box made of plywood and canvas, towed behind a C-47 transport plane. It had no engine, no armor, and no second chances. It was designed to carry 13 troops or a single jeep. The fit was claustrophobic. To load the jeep, the entire nose of the glider, including the cockpit, was hinged to swing upward. The jeep was driven straight in, chained to the flimsy wooden floor, and the nose was slammed shut. The pilot and co-pilot sat just feet above the hood of the vehicle. If the glider crashed nose first, the jeep would break loose and crush the pilots from behind. It was a suicide pact between the aviators and the drivers. On the night of June 5, 1944, hundreds of these gliders took off from airfields in England. They were towed across the English Channel in total darkness. As they approached the French coast, the tow ropes were cut. The silence that followed was terrifying. The gliders, heavy with the weight of the jeeps, descended rapidly toward the hedgerows of Normandy. The German Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles planted in the fields to rip the wings off gliders, waited for them. The landings were violent. Gliders smashed into stone walls, disintegrated against trees, or flipped over in the marshes. But from the wreckage of shattered plywood, the jeeps emerged. The crews worked frantically in the dark. They unchained the vehicles, pushed the broken nose sections aside, and cranked the engines. The sound of the Go Devil engines coughing to life in the middle of enemy territory was the sound of salvation for the paratroopers. Within minutes of crashing, the Americans had mobile machine gun platforms and ammunition carriers racing toward the bridges at Sainte-Mère-Église. The Germans were stunned. They were prepared to fight infantry. They were not prepared to fight mechanized units appearing out of thin air in their rear areas. The flying jeep had turned the chaos of the airborne drop into a mobile offensive. As the invasion moved inland, the jeep faced a new, gruesome threat. The German soldiers, masters of the ambush, realized that American officers preferred to ride in the front seat of jeeps. They also knew that the jeep usually ran with its windshield folded down on the hood to prevent glare and allow for quick firing. So the Germans strung piano wire tightly across the narrow French lanes at neck height. A jeep driving at 30 miles per hour would hit the invisible wire. The result was horrific. Drivers and officers were decapitated or suffered severe throat injuries. It was a psychological weapon, designed to make every American driver terrified of speed. The response from the Warforge didn't come from a factory in Detroit. It came from the motor pools in the field. American mechanics grabbed scrap metal, angle iron from beach obstacles, rebar from destroyed buildings, or steel fence posts. They welded a vertical steel bar about 4 feet high to the center of the Jeep's front bumper. At the top of the bar, they cut a notch or sharpened the edge. It was crude, ugly, and incredibly effective. When the Jeep hit the piano wire, the bar caught it and snapped it before it could reach the throats of the crew. This wire cutter became a standard field modification. It symbolized the adaptability of the American Army. While the Germans waited for factory-made solutions, the Americans welded trash to their bumpers and kept moving. The Jeep's greatest advocate during the drive across France was General George S. Patton. Patton was a cavalryman at heart. He believed in speed and aggression. He hated the rear echelon. He commanded his Third Army not from a chateau in the rear, but from the front seat of a modified Willys MB. He had air horns installed on his Jeep to clear the roads. He had extra armor plating welded to the floor. He stood up in the passenger seat, wearing his ivory-handled revolvers, screaming orders at his tank columns to keep moving. Patton understood that the Jeep was the modern equivalent of the cavalry horse. It allowed a commander to see the battlefield, to smell the enemy, and to impose his will on the chaos. He famously called the Jeep his bloodhound. He used it to bypass traffic jams, to scout ahead of his own tanks, and to terrorize his own supply officers if the fuel trucks weren't moving fast enough. The image of Patton in his Jeep became the icon of the American blitzkrieg. It represented a style of leadership that was forward, exposed, and relentless. But the Jeep wasn't just for generals. It was the lifeline of the entire advance. As the Allied armies raced toward the German border, they outran their supply lines. The railway network in France had been destroyed by Allied bombers. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system, struggled to keep up. The Jeep filled the gap. It carried plasma to the wounded. It carried mail from home. It carried chaplains to the dying. It was the only vehicle light enough to cross the temporary pontoon bridges before the heavy tanks could cross. There is a famous story of a German corps commander who surrendered in late 1944. He was driven to the American headquarters in the back of a Jeep. As they bounced along the ruined roads, passing column after column of American trucks and tanks, the German officer looked at the Jeep he was riding in. He asked the American driver, "Do you have horses?" The driver laughed and said, "We don't use horses, buddy, we have Jeeps." The German officer sank back into his seat, defeated. He realized that an army that could replace the horse entirely with a machine and build that machine by the millions could not be beaten. The Jeep was not just a car, it was the proof of an industrial superiority that the Wehrmacht could not comprehend. As the winter of 1944 approached, the Jeep would face its hardest environment yet. The mud turned to ice, the open cabins became freezers, but the little 60-horsepower engine would keep turning, carrying the Allies into the heart of the Reich, where the Jeep would be the first Allied vehicle to cross the Rhine and patrol the ruins of Berlin. By 1943, the War Forge of Detroit was confident it could solve any problem. The army came to Ford with a new request. "You made the Jeep go everywhere on land. Now make it swim." The result was the Ford GPA, officially known as the seagoing Jeep, but universally called the Seep by the soldiers who hated it. The concept seemed sound. Take the standard Jeep frame, wrap it in a boat-like hull, add a rudder and a propeller driven by the main engine's power takeoff. But physics is a cruel mistress. The standard Jeep weighed 2,000 pounds. The Seep, with its hull and extra gear, weighed 3,500 pounds. When the first Seeps were tested in the choppy waters off the East Coast, the engineers realized a terrifying flaw. The freeboard, the distance between the water level and the top of the side, was only a few inches. If a soldier shifted his weight or if a small wave hit the side, the Seep didn't just take on water, it swamped instantly. It sank like a stone. The sailors dubbed it the anchor. In the Pacific, the Seep was a disaster. Marines trying to drive it from landing ships to the beach found themselves drowning before they even reached the shore. It couldn't climb over coral reefs. It got stuck in the sand because the heavy boat hull ground it out before the wheels could get traction. The US military quickly declared the project a failure. They stopped production after only 12,000 units. The unstoppable box had finally found its limit, the ocean. But in a strange twist of logistical fate, the unwanted Seeps found a second life. Under the Lend-Lease Act, thousands of them were shipped to the Soviet Union, and the Russians loved them. The geography of the Eastern Front was defined by massive, wide, slow-moving rivers. The Dnieper, the Don, the Vistula, the Oder. The Germans blew every bridge as they retreated. The Red Army needed a way to get reconnaissance troops across these rivers silently, without waiting for heavy pontoon bridges to be built. The Seep was perfect for this. In the calm waters of a river, the low freeboard wasn't a problem. The Soviet mechanics, used to improvising, stripped the Seeps of unnecessary weight. They used them to ferry officers and radio men across the Oder River under the cover of fog. So while American Marines were cursing the Seep in the Pacific, Soviet heroes of the Union were driving them into Germany, using an American failure to accelerate the fall of the Third Reich. As the war in Europe ground to a halt in May 1945, the continent was a ruin. The governments had collapsed. The currency was worthless. A wheelbarrow of Reichsmarks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. In this vacuum, the Jeep became the most valuable object on the continent. It became the gold standard of the black market. A running Jeep could be traded for a villa in Italy. It could be traded for a stash of diamonds in Holland. It could buy safety for a family trying to escape the Soviet zone. The US Army faced a massive problem. Jeeps were disappearing from motor pools at an alarming rate. They weren't being stolen by enemy saboteurs. They were being lost by American soldiers who sold them to desperate civilians or French farmers. The military police, MPs, formed Jeep patrols in cities like Paris and Berlin. These white-painted Jeeps, equipped with wire cutters and radios, roamed the ruins, hunting for stolen property. But the demand was unstoppable. The Jeep was the only vehicle that could navigate the bomb-cratered streets of Berlin. It was small enough to drive around the piles of rubble that blocked larger trucks. It was simple enough to be fixed by a blacksmith. For the civilians of Europe, the Jeep was more than a car. It was a symbol of survival. There are stories of French farmers who found abandoned Jeeps in 1944, hid them in barns under haystacks for years, and then used them to plow their fields for decades after the war. The Warforge had built a machine so robust that it rebuilt the agriculture of Europe. Back in the United States, the end of the war created a different problem. The government had thousands of surplus Jeeps. They were parked in massive fields, bumper to bumper, rusting in the rain. A myth began to spread, a myth that persists to this day, of the Jeep in a crate for $50. Rumors flew that you could mail $50 to the government and they would ship you a brand new Jeep packed in grease. This was largely false. Most were sold in bulk lots. But it showed the hunger of the American public. The soldiers returning home didn't want the big, soft sedans of the 1930s. They wanted the machine they had driven to victory. They wanted the Go Devil engine. They wanted the four-wheel drive. Willys Overland, the company that had built the majority of the wartime Jeeps, saw this hunger. They were in a precarious position. Their government contracts were cancelled overnight. They had a factory designed to build tanks, not family cars. They realized they had to pivot. They had to take a weapon of war and domesticate it. They had to convince the American farmer and the construction worker that they needed a 1.4-ton truck. They began to design the CJ-2A, the civilian Jeep. But transforming a military machine into a civilian product wasn't as simple as painting it red. They had to fight against tax laws, safety regulations, and the very design that had made it famous. The transition from the battlefield to the barnyard would require one final act of engineering improvisation, and it would spark a revolution that would eventually put a 444 in every suburban driveway in America. July 17, 1945. The war in Europe was over, and the war in the Pacific was entering its final atomic phase. In Toledo, Ohio, the assembly lines at Willys Overland were slowing down. The massive government contracts that had fueled the company for 4 years were being cancelled. For most arms manufacturers, peace meant ruin. But Charles Sorensen, the head of Willys, had a different vision. He looked at the millions of GIs returning home. These were men who had spent years driving the Willys MB. They knew how to fix it with a wrench and a pair of pliers. They knew it could climb a mountain or ford a stream. Sorensen realized that these men wouldn't be satisfied going back to the heavy rear-wheel drive sedans of the pre-war era. They wanted the machine that had saved their lives. He decided to turn the weapon into a tool. The engineers took the military Jeep and modified it for the American farm. They added a tailgate so farmers could load hay bales. They moved the spare tire to the side. They added larger headlights and a power takeoff PTO unit that could drive saws, threshers, and post-hole diggers. They branded it the CJ-2A, the civilian Jeep. The marketing campaign was aggressive. They didn't sell it as a car. They sold it as the all-around farm workhorse. They claimed it could do the work of 2 draft horses and a tractor. The price was $1,090. It was a gamble. No one had ever sold a 4-wheel drive vehicle to the general public before, but the gamble paid off. The CJ-2A became a sensation, not just with farmers, but with construction workers, ranchers, and outdoor enthusiasts. The Jeep ceased to be a military designation and became a brand, arguably the first true SUV in history. But the legacy of the Jeep was not confined to North America. Its DNA had been scattered across the globe by the war, planting seeds that would grow into entirely new industries. In 1947, on the island of Anglesey in Wales, the chief designer of the British Rover Car Company Maurice Wilkes was struggling. He had an old surplus Willys Jeep that he used to tow timber on his farm. It was falling apart. He looked for a replacement, but there was nothing on the British market that could do the job. So, Wilkes decided to build his own. Legend has it that he drew the chassis design in the sand of Red Wharf Bay. He used the axles and transmission from his old Jeep as the template. Because steel was rationed in post-war Britain, he built the body out of Burma-Bright, an aluminum-magnesium alloy used for aircraft. He painted it green because the only paint available was surplus cockpit paint from a bomber factory. He called it the Land Rover. If you look at the Series 1 Land Rover, the lineage is unmistakable. It is a British Jeep, born from the same necessity and forged in the same fire of scarcity. Across the world, in the shattered ruins of Japan, a similar evolution was taking place. In 1950, when the Korean War broke out, the US military needed vehicles quickly. They couldn't ship enough Jeeps from America in time, so they turned to the Japanese automotive industry, which was still rebuilding from the ashes. They asked Toyota to build a light utility vehicle. Toyota had actually reverse-engineered a captured American Bantam Jeep back in 1941, but now they applied their own engineering philosophy. They took a truck chassis, installed a massive six-cylinder engine, and created the Toyota Jeep BJ. Willys Overland promptly sued them for trademark infringement regarding the name Jeep. So Toyota renamed it. They wanted a name that sounded as dignified as Land Rover. They called it the Land Cruiser. Today, the Land Cruiser is the gold standard of reliability in the developing world, but its heart beats with the rhythm of the original 1940 US Army specification. The Jeep's influence even extended to the aesthetic of the automobile. Before the Jeep, cars were designed with curves, chrome, and Art Deco flourishes. They were designed to look fast and elegant. The Jeep was designed with a ruler. It was flat, square, and utilitarian. It taught the world that form follows function could be a style of its own. It introduced the concept of the flat fender and the vertical grille. It normalized the idea that a car didn't need to pamper the driver. It just needed to work. Every Humvee, every G-Wagon, every Bronco that rolls off a modern assembly line is a spiritual descendant of the hastily welded prototype that Karl Probst drew in 18 hours while drinking coffee in Detroit. But the final verdict on the Jeep comes from the highest authority of the conflict. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower was asked what weapons won the Second World War, he didn't name the B-17 bomber. He didn't name the M1 Garand rifle. He didn't even name the aircraft carrier. He named 4 things: the bazooka, the Jeep, the atom bomb, and the C-47 transport plane. Notice the pattern. 3 of the 4 were tools of logistics and mobility. The Jeep made the list because it solved the oldest problem in warfare: friction. It lubricated the movement of millions of men. It allowed commanders to see the front. It allowed wire to be laid, wounded to be evacuated, and hot food to be delivered. The German Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted engineering, failed to solve this problem. They built the Tiger tank, a machine of terrifying power, but they supported it with horses and carts. When the mud came, the horses died, and the carts broke. When the snow came, the motorcycles froze. The American Army moved on rubber and gasoline. The Jeep was the physical manifestation of the American industrial philosophy. Build something simple, build it by the millions, and make it so rugged that a teenager can fix it with a hammer. In the end, the Warforge was not just about building bigger explosions. It was about building a system that could endure. The Jeep was the ultimate survivor. It survived the rejection of the peacetime army in 1940. It survived the sandstorms of Africa and the jungles of the Pacific. It survived the transition to peace. And today, 80 years later, if you go to a car dealership, you can still buy a vehicle with a 7-slot grille, round headlights, and a flat hood. It is a living fossil, a piece of history you can drive to the supermarket. It is the unstoppable box, the machine that proved that in a world of complex monsters, the simple tool is king.